Jordan here from Heir to the Mead. Today we're going to be brewing something I call Black Dragon's Blood. Let's get to it. So I picked the name Black Dragon's Blood because the popular homebrew wine recipe by Danger Dave, Dragon Blood Wine, is sort of the starting point for this whole recipe. But I ended up heavily customizing it by blending it about 50-50 with a bochet that I made where I added oak and bourbon and coffee in secondary. And I'm a big fan of bourbon and coffee and oak and fruity wines. So blending all of those things together just pretty much made exactly everything I ever wanted in a homebrew. And I'm really excited to share this recipe with you. I did it as a blend twice, and the third time is the one that we're going to be covering in this video. It's the first time that I attempted to do it as a single brew instead of brewing two meads and then blending them together. So let me walk you through the process, the recipe, and some of the things that I'm going to change next time, so hopefully it turns out even better. For primary. First, a quick disclaimer. I did end up having to back sweeten this brew, but to simplify it all into one step for next time, I've just gone ahead and increased the amount of clover honey equal to the amount of sugars that I had to add in secondary. So, for primary, you are going to need 8 1/4 pounds of clover honey, 7 pounds of bochet honey, and remember, it's totally okay to use whatever cheap honey you got lying around for bochet stuff, 8 pounds of triple berry blend. In my local area, the triple berry blend I have available is raspberries, blueberries, and blackberries. You don't have to find that exact blend, but if you're trying to match me, that's what I used. And then finally, once we have all the fruit and all the honey in our fermenter, we're going to add water until the total volume of our must is 3 5/8 gallons. For secondary, I made a cold brew kind of mocha coffee using both coffee and cacao nibs. But then I found out with my bench trials that the bourbon and the cacao nibs really weren't playing well together. So I ended up fortifying with Everclear instead. Next time around, I would actually recommend either picking coffee or cacao nibs instead of using both. So, my recommendation is 14 ounces of either ground coffee or roasted and ground cacao nibs with 2 quarts of water to make the cold brew. Then, depending on whether you're working with coffee or cacao nibs, you fortify either with a bourbon or with Everclear. Unfortunately, I can't tell you exactly how much of the spirit you're going to need to fortify with because it depends on the ABV of the specific spirit you pick. But if you can manage to pick up a handle of it and either drink the rest or save it for the next brew, you should be more than good to go. Ultimately, you're going to be trying to fortify your secondary addition up to about 17% ABV. The reason for this is simply that we're only stabilizing this brew via the ABV tolerance of the yeast, and if you use 71B like I did, it should land somewhere in the 14 to 16% range. Aiming for 17% gives us just a little bit of a safety net to make sure that our brew isn't getting diluted and fermentation doesn't restart. For nutrients, feel free to use your preferred calculator and your favorite addition schedule, but here's what I used. 12.5 grams of GoFerm to rehydrate my yeast, 6.1 grams of Fermate O, 6.8 grams of Fermate K, and 7.9 grams of diammonium phosphate. I will note here, I intended to use a nice staggered schedule over about the first week, but this fermented so fast that all my nutrients had to go in the first 2 days. So if you do brew this, keep an eye on your gravity and make sure that everything gets in before the 1/3 sugar break. Now for the process. So the first thing I did was just open up all my frozen berry bags and dump them straight into my brew bucket so they could start defrosting. And I snapped the lid on just to keep the bugs and dust out while I was doing other things, like going into the garage and weighing out 7 pounds of honey straight into a stock pot so I could just take it back inside, pop it on the stove, and get the bochet cooking. Now, how dark you take your honey in a bochet is a pretty big question. Honestly, it's largely personal preference, but I will say, don't be afraid to take it dark. If you want to match me, or try to, I have my last color check right about there. Once I was satisfied with the bochet, I went ahead and added some water just to stop it from hardening and to make it a little bit easier to pour. Normally, you need quite a bit of time for your bochet honey to cool down, but normally you also need quite a bit of time for your frozen berries to warm up. So it ends up being a really convenient and coincidental part of this recipe that you can dump your still hot bochet honey onto your still freezing berries and really speed up the process of getting the must to a pitchable temperature. So it was about this point in the process I started rehydrating my yeast with Go Firm, just per the instructions on the packaging, and I used 10 grams of Lalvin 71B. With that out of the way, I weighed the rest of my honey, added it to my must, and stirred the heck out of it. As you can see on my bucket here, at this point in the process, I had a little under 2.5 gallons of must. Remember, our target volume is 3 5/8 gallons. But since all my fruit and honey have been added at this point, I can simply top off with water until I hit that 3 5/8 gallon mark that I made on my bucket, and then stir a bunch more. I checked in on my must temperature here, and it's around 60 degrees Fahrenheit, a little on the cold side, so I put the lid back on to wait for the must to finish warming up. A little while later, it's warm enough to pitch my yeast, and I stirred some more for good measure. And that's the official start of the brew. For the first week, make sure to punch the fruit cap a couple times a day so you don't get any mold issues. Now, this fermented really fast, so I actually went to rack after just 2 weeks, but this is another thing I'm going to change next time around. Between the fruit and the coffee, this brew came out pretty acidic, and it needed some tannin balancing. I ended up adding 2.25 grams of tannin powders, but I believe next time, staying in primary on the fruit skins for a full 4 to 6 weeks will lead to significantly more natural tannin development, and hopefully, I'll avoid the need for the tannin powder completely. After about 2 more weeks to allow most of the fruit gunk to settle out, I set to making my mocha coffee. These secondary ingredients are actually best to add during your second racking because you'll top off the carboy and replace any headspace issues that could be created by racking off of that fruit sediment. You can see I'm using coffee beans in addition to roasting and grinding cacao nibs, but like I said earlier, I'd actually suggest picking just one. Either go coffee and bourbon or cacao with a neutral spirit like Everclear or vodka. Either way, after I put everything through the grinder, I mixed it all up and placed it in some little reusable brew bags. I was pretty sure this wouldn't all fit in a single pitcher, so I split it up into 2, evenly distributed the brew bags, and set it all in the fridge to cold brew overnight. About 24 hours later, I fortified my cold brew up to about 17% ABV with the help of a blending calculator to determine what ratio I needed to use given the ABV of the Everclear I was using. I could tell I would need at least a quart of coffee to fill up that headspace, so I actually racked that into the carboy before racking the mead, so that the racking process and the swirl you usually get going would take care of most of the mixing for me. After racking the mead, I had the perfect amount of headspace, tight enough that I wasn't worried about aging it as is if I liked the flavor, but also enough room to add more fortified coffee if I wanted to bring that flavor out more. So I pulled off a quick taste test and determined that, yeah, I wanted to bring the coffee flavor more forward. So I prepped another quart of fortified coffee and topped off the carboy about as tight as I could. And at this point, I was all done except for bulk aging. And this particular mead is actually very drinkable young, shockingly so considering that mine hit 16% before I added the 17% fortified coffee. Though to be safe, I would suggest giving it at least a month before bottling just to make sure that those secondary additions have all blended in evenly and any extra fruit sediment has all fallen out. Now, obviously, when you're brewing mead, patience is your friend, so waiting longer will pretty much only make it better. But if you're going to be impatient, this isn't a bad brew to do it on. And that, my friends, brings us to today, where I have pulled off a small taster. You can see here. Now, I've got most of this still in a carboy bulk aging. It doesn't necessarily need to be bulk aging anymore. It's just a matter of storage space for me. If I bottled everything that I have ready to bottle at this point, I wouldn't have enough storage for it. Whereas I don't have a ton of stuff in secondary right now, so some of the secondary stuff's just staying there. But yeah, this is what we got. It's got a nice dark kind of brown color to it, like you see in a lot of like bourbon barrel aged stuff. And it's a little hard to see on the camera here, but there's a hint of red in there too, that I think is coming through from all the fruit that's in here. I got a lot of that coffee in the nose, with a hint of some of the fruits that are in here. On the short sip, I love the complexity of the fruit and the coffee playing off of each other. I think the cacao nibs kind of got lost in there, and I'm not really picking up chocolatey notes or anything like that from this, and that reinforces what I said earlier. I think you got to go all in on one or the other. You either just go for the coffee and don't bother with the cacao nibs, or drop the coffee. That's especially a good option if you're not a coffee person, and go for the cacao nibs instead. I might sweeten this up a little bit next time. And it could maybe even still, after the tannin powders I added to this version, could maybe even still use a little bit more on the tannins. It's a little on the acidic side. I'm really hoping that, like I also mentioned earlier, the 4 to 6 weeks in primary on the fruit skins, I'm hoping would really help fix that. So definitely some things I want to change next time, like I've been telling you guys throughout the video. But I love this combination of flavors. I'm really eager to keep making this and refining it. Until there is a perfect version of it, if such a thing exists. I would be super excited if any of you want to try the Black Dragon's Blood brew here. Let me know your notes. Put it down in the comments what you did, the things that worked for you, the things that didn't, what you're going to change next time, all that kind of stuff, and how you liked it in the end. Again, this has been Jordan with Arrow to the Mead. Thank you for joining me.